Okay, welcome to Character Drawing Tutorial. This one is about posing, weight, force, and drawing characters in perspective. So this is the second video of a 3-part series that I'm posting, where I'm editing down a class that I taught 3 or 4 years ago on Class 101 called Drawing Characters in Motion, Anatomy, Appeal, Posing, and More. So this video specifically is gonna be about posing. What makes a pose natural, weight and force, and figures in perspective. These are the videos we are going to be watching today. So as a recap, if you didn't watch the last one, this entire class has about 8 chapters, starting from absolute fundamentals, going into posing and dynamic drawing, and ending with character stylization and design. I have put this class on PayHip for $30 if you would like to download this document, which has every video linked to Google Drive. I'm going to upload the ones that I've highlighted on YouTube for free because these are my favorites and they're taught in a way that I still teach things with mentees and students. So yes, this video is for those of you who have trouble drawing characters and humans in a natural way, and you always find yourself drawing like stiff characters or characters that are like posing weirdly or unnaturally, or you're like a little bit confused about how to draw characters from a perspective that's not just like straight front on. So I hope this video will clear up some of that and give you some tips on how to combat stiffness in posing. Let's get to it. Hey guys, Lexon here. This video is about finding reference and inspiration for posing. So welcome to the Intro to Posing chapter. Every chapter from here till the end is going to start with a video about finding reference and inspiration. And I put this on every chapter because it is a really important topic that I don't see addressed very much. But I think curating your taste is just as important as learning how to draw. So for me, there was kind of a moment where I realized that I needed to start learning how to pose characters and that the characters could be posed. So here I've collected some characters that I drew about 2 years ago. Around this time, I really didn't see anything wrong with my drawings or how I drew characters. But one day I did a post and one of my friends commented on it. He was like, "Oh, you drew that character in the same pose again, huh?" And I was like, what? And then I realized that I had one pose up my sleeve. When I was drawing a full body character, I drew this exact pose on every single character. Facing slightly to the left, one leg straight, one leg out. Maybe a little bit of variation based on their personality, what they're doing up here. But other than that, there's really not much diversity at all. I think this was the one full body pose that I knew how to do, so I put it on every character. But in real life, people stand in a ton of different ways. So what is the number one thing that I learned to go from using the same pose for every character to be able to draw any pose ever, basically? And the secret is not really a secret at all. The only thing you need to do is use reference. None of these were drawn using any reference whatsoever. Like literally none of them. I made up the pose from imagination, I did the clothes from imagination, I drew their hair from imagination. Everything was made up from my mind. And there's nothing inherently wrong with drawing from imagination, but you have to know that your imagination is kind of a limited well of resources. What you can draw from imagination is limited to what you've drawn before. So what happened here is that I learned how to draw one character, probably from reference, standing in this pose. And that got added to my visual library so I can access it again and draw any other character in this pose. And because I got complacent with that, I never really tried to expand and add different things to my visual library. And, same with the pants. The pants on every single character are drawn the same way, with a belt strap, with a zip here, and a pocket here. Every single pant the same way. I didn't really try to look beyond to challenge what pants actually look like and what kind of different pants existed out there. But since this video is about posing, let's talk about this in relation to posing. So I made this chart to talk about what I really mean. So your visual library is really at the center of all of this. Your visual library holds everything that you've ever drawn and understand how to draw. It is something you can go back to and pull from and mix and match to draw different new things. So the things that go into your visual library are everything that inspires you, cool artists who have cool styles that you want to learn and emulate, cool reference that you find online that really matches what you like to draw, what you like to see from other artists, cool media, whatever video games you like to play, what anime you like to watch, what kind of movies you like to watch. And all of these things are inspiration that feeds into your visual library. But collecting these things is not going to automatically add it to your visual library. In order to input it, you have to draw them and you have to study them. If you just collect, nothing's going to happen. And so once you've drawn what it is that is inspiring you, once you've studied it, it gets added to your visual library and you now know how to draw that thing. The same principle applies to basically everything in art. If you want to do character design, you have to draw a lot of existing character design. Nothing comes from consuming things. You have to actually take the things that inspire you and draw them. I like to think of it as a video game. You're a character, you've just entered a new world, and the map is all dark. The more you explore, the more the map expands and reveals itself to you. And the more you explore, the more regions will open up for you, and the more clarity you gain in that region of the map. But you have to go out and explore. You can't just stay in one spot or else you're going to be surrounded by darkness forever. And once you start exploring, you can start to develop those regions. Maybe you stay in the fashion photography region for a while, and you start to build a home there. Or maybe you decide to travel elsewhere to the breakdancing region, right? You eventually start to define your own map, your own world of what your art is going to be informed by. Alright, so now that that's out of the way, what do I actually use to find reference? The answer is really super simple. I just use Pinterest. And here's kind of a look at my chaotic Pinterest accounts. If you come here, it's not going to look like this. I have a lot of locked posts just because I make boards for like literally everything. And so I do have a public board called Poses, which, like its namesake, I do save a bunch of pose reference on. If I'm kind of like out of ideas about like what to draw, I'll just come to my Pinterest boards and like just choose something random. Just choose something random and draw a character doing that. But as you can see, there's no one way to draw any pose, which is something I didn't realize when I was starting out. For example, if you opened a canvas and you think to yourself, I want to draw a character sitting, what comes to mind? Maybe someone sitting cross-legged on the floor, or maybe someone sitting in a chair. Most than likely, you don't have a huge library of what people look like when they're sitting. For example, are they sitting cross-legged on the floor? Are they sitting in a desk chair? Are they sitting with their legs splayed out? Are they sitting with their legs tucked in? Are they sitting on a step? Are they sitting with their back to you, looking back? Are they sitting in a shopping cart? There's a ton of different ways people can sit, and the more that you draw from reference, the more that is added to your visual library. So the next time you think I want to draw a character sitting, you can ask yourself all those questions, and you have way more options to choose from. There was a point in time where I felt like I had run out of things to draw. Like I felt like I had thoroughly explored characters, which is kind of a wild thing to think, but that's how I felt. Maybe I was just like lacking in inspiration. But what I didn't realize is that if I now know how to draw a character from the front, side, and back, what I didn't know was how to draw them from the front, side, and back, but at a top-down angle. So that became the next step. There's literally an infinite variety of different poses and different camera angles that you can draw from. And the more you draw, the more rich your understanding of art is going to be. Hey guys, Lexon here. This video is titled, What Makes a Pose Natural? I'm pretty sure this is something that most people don't really take notice of, and it's kind of a hard thing to answer. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask ourselves the question, what makes a pose unnatural? Because we as people, we're really good at picking out things that look weird, that look stiff, that look unnatural. And so what I've done is I put together a quick list of things that make poses look weird. So an unnatural pose is going to be stiff, it's going to be off balance, it's going to disregard force and tension, and it's going to have a confusing context. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to go through each of these things and expand on them by critiquing older art that I found. Alright, so let's start with stiffness. When it comes to posing, we should break the body down into 3 key components. First of which is the head, and then the ribs, and then the pelvis. So let's just mark these with ovals for now. Let's just take the head over here and redraw it. The head can rotate on all 3 axes, right? This is a head that's looking straight at you, but we can rotate it to the right or the left, and we can rotate that up or down. And then this, we can tilt this entire thing to the right or to the left. So like this. Right, these are 3 axes of motion. And we can apply all of that to the head, ribs, and pelvis. So let me just mark what this character currently is at. His head is currently kind of looking straight at us, like this. The ribs are kind of the same. And the pelvis is also the same. And so this is stiff because all of these components are kind of tilted the same way. You have 3 axes of motion here. No person who is standing in a natural way is going to position their head, ribs, and pelvis in the same direction in all 3 axes. Alright, so let's do a little experiment. Let's just draw someone's head like this. Let's say they're looking down and slightly to the right. Then let's draw their ribcage in and put it facing the opposite direction. So let's tilt it this way instead of this way, and then make it face the opposite direction of the head. And as for the pelvis, let's counterbalance the torso here and make it face the other way and be tilted opposite of the torso. So this is going to lead to a pretty natural looking pose. So let's start from the opposite extreme. So let's make all of these the same. So let's make everything kind of tilted this way and tilted this way. Right? No one really is able to hold their body perfectly like this. And this quickly became pretty stiff because everything is just rotated in the same direction. All their body parts are facing the same way. And so remember that you have control over tilting the head side to side, up and down, and also tilting the entire form right to left. And so with these 3 axes, you can transform a stiffer pose into a natural pose. What you'll often notice that a lot of times the head and the hips are going to be the same, and then it is the torso that offsets them. So for example, if I just copy this, if I tilt the torso, it's going to start looking better automatically. So when it comes to this guy, let's change things up a bit. I think his head is fine, but I think it'd be more interesting if maybe he was looking to the right some more. And maybe looking up a little bit. His rib cage, I'm going to tilt. I'm going to make it face slightly to the left to counterbalance the rightwards facing head. And the pelvis, I'm going to make that match the angle of the head like this. Alright, so when you connect the pieces, it's going to start looking a lot better automatically. On second thought, maybe the head's going to look better looking down. Yeah. Make sure the shoulders are going to follow the angle of the rib cage. Alright, so we fixed his stiff pose. just by using the different axes of rotation that every body part has. Alright, so that addresses stiffness. Let's move on to off balance and disregarding force and tension. Let's use this one as an example. Alright, so this guy is clearly falling over. Let's map out his forms here. And as you can see, it obviously is kind of stiff because all of these are once again facing the same direction. But the bigger problem are with his feet. I think I was trying to go for some kind of like perspective here, which is why his feet go back like that. But it does kind of just look like he's falling over. And being off balance doesn't necessarily indicate a bad pose right away. Off balance can, I mean, it's a key aspect to having dynamic poses, but when a character is supposed to be resting, when they're supposed to be interacting with gravity and the ground, then being off balance is automatically making your character look unnatural. And a lot of this is just going to come from drawing a lot of people that are standing and seeing like, and understanding how they interact with like gravity. But a pattern you'll notice is that usually people are going to favor a leg or favor a side. People like to shift their weight. Usually they aren't going to stand like on both feet at the same time. And so for this person, they're standing, but usually when we think about force and tension, especially in a standing pose that's gonna be gravity in the floor. So you have to remember that the floor is here and pushing up, which means this body has weight and this body is pushing down. And usually in that case, we're going to rest most of our weight onto one side and let the other side relax. By doing this, we can indicate that gravity, yes, gravity is a force on this character, and this character does have weight. A character that is like this, that stands on both feet, who is like tilting forward and kind of falling over, is not being affected by gravity or the weight of their own body. Alright, so that's weight and balance. Let's try the same thing on another character here. Let's do it on this character here. So she is facing many of the same issues as the guy in the top right here. So let's map out her forms here. And these by themselves, they look pretty okay, honestly. But the main thing is that she is not being very affected by gravity or her own weight. So yeah, she looks like she's falling backwards with her legs out like this. But really, if her hips are tilted like this and her chest is tilted like this, then most of her weight is going to be on this leg that's pushing the hip up. Right? So this leg ought to be pretty planted into the ground. So as long as her weight is on one foot, then the other leg can be doing whatever, you know, it can be bent, or it could go out, or this foot could be tilted upwards. But you should guarantee that the weight is on one leg. And now that I'm looking at it, I think it could probably be angled a little bit inwards. And this foot can be facing outwards. Alright, so if that's addressing weight and force and tension, the last thing is confusing context. And this basically just addresses like the mood of the pose, the attitude of the character, and if that fits what's going on with their body. So for example, this guy is shooting a gun. Honestly, it makes no sense. No one really shoots a gun like this. I can't really figure out what the mood or attitude of this guy is. Like, is he aggressive? Is he regretful? Is he trying to be a badass? I don't really understand what he's trying to do. His body doesn't really indicate any of that. Basically, when you're drawing a pose, just think to yourself, what is the point of this pose? What am I trying to say with this? What is this character feeling? So when we go back here, for example, what exactly am I trying to say with this guy? Is he relaxed? Is he intention? Is he trying to intimidate me? I can't really tell what he's trying to like tell me with his pose. And so that's what confusing context means. A good pose has a point, you know? The pose that we fixed here, he feels a little bit more relaxed, maybe like he's taunting us a little bit. So those are really all the main elements of what to look for when you're drawing a pose. If your pose feels unnatural, go through this checklist. Is it stiff? Are all the body parts rotated the same way? That could be one of your problems. Is it off balance? Is your character like not being affected by gravity whatsoever? Is your character disregarding force and tension? And is there a point to your drawing? And is it realistic in the context? Ask yourself these questions, and hopefully that'll fix your unnatural posing problems. Alright, so I'm gonna do a quick speed run of using the things we learned in this video, aka using all axes of rotation and paying attention to gravity and weight and trying to make a pose that fits our context. And I'm just gonna do maybe 10 little silhouettes, and this is kind of what I want you to do for the assignment, which is just to experiment with the different rotations you can put on a character's body and explore how weight can express itself in the body and its relationship to the floor. And if you get stuck on this assignment trying to think of poses from imagination, feel free to use whatever reference that you want. I'm gonna have Pinterest up on the side in case I get stuck. Alright, so for this sped up portion, I'm going to do a bit of a voiceover just so you won't be watching in silence, and so I can talk about the things that I was thinking about while I was doing these. So I didn't really talk about arms in the main section of this video, but basically arms are good for acting and expressiveness. When you're just standing around, arms often go on your hips, they go in your pockets, maybe you're scratching your head. I changed my mind quite a lot just to figure out what I wanted to do with the second one, but ended up doing a back pose with the head turning towards us. A really fun way to tackle this assignment would be to set up a camera and film yourself for like a minute or something, just shifting your weight, doing random things like idle actions. If you do that, try to be natural, because when you're in front of a camera, sometimes you do tend to stiffen up and act unnaturally. But since this assignment is about drawing natural looking poses, if you take a reference video or photos of yourself, then really try to exaggerate the tilt of your head, your rib cage and your pelvis, and then your line of action, and exaggerate where your weight is. And during this whole drawing process, I also was thinking about what kind of personalities these poses give off. Like the one I just drew, that one was kind of like a cool guy. So maybe like a bad boy type character. This one right here, maybe kind of lazy, kind of sleepy, kind of shy. And this person here has their arms crossed and their weight is mostly on the foot to the left. They seem kind of reserved, kind of uptight. And in this one, I experimented with putting the head, ribcage, and pelvis like not right on top of each other, but rather like at an angle to see what kind of pose would come out of it. So a lot of times I don't go into this like knowing what pose I'm gonna draw, but just like by positioning the head, ribcage, and pelvis in an interesting way can inspire you to draw new and interesting poses that you weren't exactly expecting. Alright, so that's 10 little thumbnails applying the things that we talked about today. So things I really tried to experiment with was, if this head was going to be tilted this way in this one, I tilted it the other way in the next one, and then other way in the next one. Same with direction. For example, if this head is tilted down, this one's tilted up, and then down again. So when you're doing your assignment, be thinking about those things. So yeah, I look forward to seeing your assignments, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Hey guys, Lexon here. This video is about weight and force. We kind of touched upon this subject in the last video, but it's really so key when it comes to drawing poses and drawing characters in general that I decided to make another video to expand on this topic. When you're drawing a character in space, that character is being subjected to a certain number of forces. Those forces could be gravity, their own body weight, the way their muscles and tendons and bones are like all interacting and pulling on each other. And those forces could also include things like wind, water, if they're underwater. The main idea here is just to remember that whatever you draw, that character has mass, weight, and energy. They don't exist in a limbo where gravity doesn't exist, that air doesn't exist, where their body weight is non-existent. When you're drawing a character, you're trying to make the audience believe that that character exists in a space. And that means that the character is going to be affected by other things in the space. They can interact with other objects, with other characters, and be affected by forces and objects that are in that space with them. Maybe you want to use a pose like this for reference to draw your own character. Your priority should not be to draw this one-to-one. Your priority should be to understand where the points of tension are, where the energy is in her body, where she feels tension, where she is relaxed, and what forces are acting upon her body right now. These are our priorities here. Find the points of tension, find the forces that are acting upon her body. And the first thing is that if your character exists on Earth, on a planet, there's definitely going to be gravity. So gravity is pulling her down. Her body weight is being pulled down. Meanwhile, the floor is pushing up against that. So the main points of tension here are going to be where her feet are meeting the ground. And everything from there is going to be falling. Human beings are constantly just always falling. So we're always just trying to regain balance. So for this girl here, in her body, the way she keeps balance is right here on her hip. So for this girl, her hip right here, this is the point that's counteracting the gravity and the floor. Her body is kind of falling towards her hip here. It's all relaxed, falling towards her hip. And when it hits her hip, it goes straight down and plants into the floor to where her feet meets the floor. And from this point also, her hips are falling this way. So the hip really is the point that everything is falling from or interrupting the energy in the body. Her body wants to fall, interrupted by the hip. And then it's falling this way from the hip and it's going to be interrupted by the floor here. So this leg here, this leg itself has a lot of tension and release in it. She's on the ball of her feet and not really on the entire flat of her foot. So what's happening here is that there's going to be tension in the arc of her foot here. And there's tension back here in her calf in order to keep her on the balls of her feet. And because there's tension right here, it's got to be counterbalanced by the tension in her calves right here. And because all of this is kind of falling from this point again, her thigh is relaxed down here, but it's kind of in tension up here. And this basketball here, this provides 2 points of tension right here, where it meets her waist, and right here where her arm rests on it. And so her arm is falling over the basketball. It's squishing over the basketball and falling over it. And her hand is falling from the wrist here. And so you should be able to really feel what she's feeling here. She's relaxed up here, and then bam, hits the hips, and then bam, her leg goes straight into the floor. While this leg here, it's stretched here and stretched at the arc of the foot, which goes straight into the ground here. When you're drawing this, this means making really good use of your straights and curves. So her torso is falling over here. And this leg, you could choose to do it several ways. You could choose to make the inside of the leg a straight and say the inside of the leg is where the tension is. and that the outside of the leg is where she's going to be more relaxed. Or you could go the opposite direction and say that the outside of the leg is where the tension is at. Make that a straight, and then make the inside of the leg relax. And same with this other leg over here. You could choose to make the upper thigh a curve and the inside a straight in order to emphasize the stretch in her inner thigh. Or you can make the top of the leg straight and make the inside of her thigh a curve in order to emphasize how her leg has some mass that is falling. So it just depends on what you want to emphasize, but you have to be able to picture the tension and release in the body and where the mass is going. So her body is definitely falling this way until it hits her hip, and that is planted really firmly into the ground. And this leg here is pretty relaxed until it hits the ball of the foot. And the ball of the foot is planted, and the arc is going up in tension, and that leads to the Achilles tendon being in tension here. Alright, so I'm going to make the top a straight and the bottom a curve in order to emphasize how her leg is having mass that is pulling down. And I think I'll make the outside of her thigh a straight in order to emphasize this angle here. How the hip is really the tension point in all her body. Next, the basketball here. And her arm is just falling over that. And her hand is going the opposite way. And this arm over here is kind of hugging her body and falling over her thigh. Alright, so when you're studying a pose or using a pose for reference, it's more important to capture the energy and the tension and release of that pose than to copy it one-to-one. Make it so that the person looking at this drawing can feel that her feet really are planted here, that her hip really is holding up her body, that this pose probably does make the arc of your foot and your Achilles tendon kind of hurt. Okay, so we did a standing pose. Let's do a sitting pose next. Alright, so take a good look at his pose here. Pretend that you are this guy. Pretend that you are making this pose, and maybe go ahead and make this pose yourself. Where are the tension points? Where are you relaxed? What is your body doing? What is your body feeling? And a lot of this weight and tension stuff, a lot of you may be intuitively doing this already because it's just the natural way to understand how a body works. So for him, tension points are where he's sitting here, where his butt meets the chair, where his feet meet the ground, as always, and here where his arm is falling over his thigh. And a little bit, it's hard to tell what's happening back here, but I think his shoulder is resting on the back of the chair here. So these are the points we need to pay attention to and exaggerate. As always, our intention is always to take this image here, this image of someone who is a real person from real life, and translate it into a 2D drawing so that someone who looks at that drawing can feel what this person here is feeling. So what that means is not copying one-to-one. It means being able to extract what this person is feeling and put it on paper. Alright, so let's start here where he's sitting. Probably the most important part, right? His knees here, similar to the hips on the previous girl, his knees are going to be points of interruption. So his lower leg is driving into the ground this way. His knees are like precariously holding this leg up. This one is more relaxed. And from the knees, the thighs go back onto the chair. There's several different ways, as always, that you could choose to interpret this depending on what you think he feels. We could choose to do like a squishy thigh here so that once it hits the chair, it can be squished back by the chair. Or we could choose to do something more tensiony like this. And for the top of the thigh, same thing, you could choose to emphasize like weight is going down this way, and so the top is going to be flat, the bottom is going to be curved. Or we could go with the reference a little bit more and make the top curved, a little bit more relaxed, and tension point here, where his arm is meeting his thigh, which means that this shoulder here is a falling point. So his arm here is falling from the shoulder and until it meets the thigh here. And from there, wrist is another tension point. Tension points, they're usually joints, right? It just makes sense like that because the joints bend. The joints have tendons. The hand is falling this way. And this arm, I guess it's over the back of the chair here, but it's falling this way. And could exaggerate his arm a little bit more. So here's our draw over. And looking like this, we could probably exaggerate how his torso is falling, because I feel like he's kind of shifted like this. So I'm going to exaggerate that. And you could just shape design and line design forever. For example, this lower leg here, there's multiple ways you could interpret that. You can interpret it like this. For example, that the tibia here is going to be the tension point and the mass is falling down this way. Or you could do what I originally had, which was this. Just make sure to choose something, and it has to be convincing to you. We talked about weight and force and tension points and straights and curves. So your assignment for this video is going to be exactly what I just did. Do 3 pose studies focused on weight and force, 1 standing pose, 1 sitting pose, 1 action pose. When you're drawing a pose, I just want you to focus on capturing the energy that the person is feeling and transmitting it to the person that's going to see this image. So I do want you to find your own reference photos, pick reference photos of poses that you actually want to draw. I look forward to seeing your assignments, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Hey guys, Lexon here. This video is about drawing the figure in perspective. So one of the main things we'll be talking about in this video is foreshortening. Let me tell you, I watched a lot of tutorials before making this video just so I could scope out the scene already and see what other artists had been saying about foreshortening and how they taught it. Most of the videos I watched do a pretty decent job, and basically they spend the whole video teaching form. Form is obviously something that is super universal. When you want to draw anything, you should think about the form. So one of my favorite tutorials was by Saikra. He did a really good video about foreshortening. If you want to go there to like learn some quick tips and tricks about how to do it, he uses the coil technique, which I never personally used, but I can understand why it would be useful. For example, he would use a coil in order to describe like the form of an object before tracing lines over it and then erasing the coil. Basically, this works because all of these coils are like intersections of a form. They help you understand the inner workings of what a form is. And another way that he explains it is, so for example, if you have a person, sorry, I'm just like reteaching Saikra, but there is something that I think barely any tutorials talked about, which I will get to after I explain what Saikra does, which is treat the arm here, treat the shoulder here as the origin point. And if this is your arm, your elbow ends at the bottom of your ribs where your belly button kind of is. So your elbow and then your hand. And he basically says if you want to foreshorten, you cannot surpass the length of your arm here. So you can't draw like an arm that extends further than that, like if the hand was out here, because that is impossible. Or so he says. And to a certain extent, yes, because the way he understands it is that if you raise your arm to the side, this is how long it is, right? Elbow, hand. And if you want to turn that in space and foreshorten it, then you do it in an arc around the shoulder. So you would go like this, with the shoulder here as the midpoint. So if you wanted to turn this arm and see it foreshortened, you would have to do this, like the hand would travel along this arc here with the shoulder as the midpoint. And the elbow would travel along an arc here. And this is something that it does work, but there is one other element that does kind of disrupt all of this. And that is the introduction of camera lenses. So whenever you're drawing, you need to think like a camera. You are the director sitting behind the camera. You get to decide where you're looking at this character from. So when you're drawing in perspective especially, you're thinking, are you looking at the character from above, below, to the side? And you also have to think about, are you close to the subject, far away from the subject? And you have to think about what kind of lens are you using. So when Cypress says that you cannot extend your arm further than this point, he's referring explicitly to someone who is using a telephoto lens. A telephoto lens is a lens that is going to compress your subject and display its true proportions. And I think this is how like most character artists draw, but they don't really know it. So take a look at this image here. The longer the lens, the more millimeters there are, the more telephoto that lens is going to be. So the more flat and true to proportion the subject is going to be. The smaller the lens, the wider the angle. So a 20 millimeter lens, even though it's the same subject, is going to massively distort the subject versus if you use a 200 millimeter lens. And so most phone cameras are actually between 20 and 35 millimeters. So it's actually going to distort you a lot. So when you're taking a reference photo, you need to think about that. That if you're like reaching out your arm, it's going to be kind of distorted because it's a wide angle lens. A wide angle lens is going to exaggerate space. Okay, so let's use the example of like reaching your hand out. I'm going to draw a character here. Here's their head. Let's say a hand is about, it's a little bit smaller than your face. It's kind of like exactly the same size as your face here. Let's say this is your hand here. That's how big a hand is, like in comparison to your face. And so a telephoto lens is going to keep that true to proportion. If your hand is reaching out, it's going to continue like staying the right proportion. So if we connect this back to their body, it's probably going to be something like this. Yeah, drawing through the form. Right, this is a telephoto lens. The hand is basically how big it would be normally, and this is how most artists draw. But if you want to start to understand like dynamic perspective and how to exaggerate foreshortening and perspective, then you need to understand like wide angle lenses. So if I draw the same thing in a wide angle lens, what happens is that the things that appear closer to the camera appear massively closer, and the things that are farther away appear massively farther away. So let me pull up some examples of like wide angle lens photos. Yeah, this is an example of a wide angle lens. The foot is really close to the camera, so it's very big. It's definitely not like a realistic foot size in comparison to the rest of its body, right? Most like cinematic shots are going to be wide angle. So for example, Felicia Chen's work, she uses a lot of wide angle lenses. This is a wide angle lens. The wide angle lens lets us see a lot more horizontally, and it's going to warp the vertical perspective lines. And we'll go into more detail about this later if it's unclear. But basically, wide angle lens, just remember, wide angle lenses will exaggerate whatever you're drawing. So the foot is a lot closer to the camera, so it's gonna appear a lot bigger. The rest of him is going to recede into space and appear more consistently normal here. A lot of anime, a lot of like shonen anime also does this. For example, Soul Eater. Soul Eater is a really good example. They are really appealing to me because it's exaggerated. It's not true to life. A hand can extend way past where it should be, and it can be a lot bigger than it should be because it is a wide angle lens. And here's an example of like a telephoto lens. You can see nothing here is really exaggerated. Everything here is a normal proportion. Here's another example of like a wide angle lens, right? She is really close to the camera, her head especially. So her head is going to appear bigger than the rest of her body, which is like converging downwards and getting smaller. This lady in the back has way more consistent proportions because she is farther away from the camera. And in a wide angle lens, the farther away you are from the camera, the more it's going to resemble a telephoto lens, which is compressed and true to proportion. Another artist who is pretty fond of wide angle lenses is Alele's. So a lot of her drawings use wide angle lenses, which exaggerate the character, is not true to proportion. And honestly, I find it a lot more interesting to look at and to draw than something that is like a telephoto lens. You know, most artists don't realize the difference between lenses, so they just always draw with a telephoto lens and don't understand like why things are exaggerated or how they're exaggerated when they are. So this is a pretty good example. These two, Soul Eater again. Soul Eater is really good at this, really good inspiration if you want to watch a show that has really good stylization. So the things that are closer to the camera are going to appear massively closer. Things in the background are going to recede quickly. Things in the midground are going to be true to proportion. And so if we come back here and draw a wide angle lens version of this guy here, his hand is going to get a lot bigger and a lot less true to proportion. So depending on how close he is to the camera, how close the camera is to his hand, it's going to be a lot bigger. And going back into space, we can make use of Cycra's coil technique. His shoulder is about here, and we're going to coil forwards and meet his wrist. So if we just do this using simple primitive forms, then let's just use a cylinder. So a telephoto cylinder would probably just kind of be like this. Maybe there is a slight indication of this circle being bigger than this circle because it is coming towards the camera, so it is getting bigger. But a wide angle lens, if we start at the same size, it's going to end a lot more exaggerated. And when you're finding the midpoint, for example, the telephoto cylinder, the midpoint would just be like in the middle, around like here. The front proportion is going to be a little bit bigger than the back proportion just because it is receding in space, just not as much as a wide angle lens. So the middle would be about here. But in a wide angle, what's closer to the camera is going to be massively closer, massively bigger. So the midpoint in a wide angle lens is going to be a lot more farther back. It's going to be about back here. So the front proportion is going to be a lot bigger than the back proportion. And honestly, when you're drawing exaggerated like a wide angle lens, there's really not a need to draw proper proportions, which is why I like doing wide angle lenses, because you can just mess around and have fun and no one's really going to know like if things are in the wrong place or things are in the right place or things are like out of proportion or in proportion. When you draw something in a wide angle lens, it's about the exaggeration, it's about the fun, It's about the energy. Whereas like something in a telephoto lens, you have to like make sure everything's in the right proportion, the hand's the right size. You just have to be a lot more accurate, whereas wide angles allow for a lot more exploration and inaccuracies. Okay, now that we've addressed different types of lenses, let's talk about actually posing characters in a space. So here I have 2 examples. This is a bunch of thumbnails that I did and some examples from Jessica Lin, who is really good at simplifying perspective and characters in space. And usually you'll notice that storyboard artists are really good at developing a shorthand for understanding perspective and how to place characters in perspective. So if this is something you're really interested in, I would suggest like studying storyboards and storyboard artists like Jessica. So basically what I've noticed is that these artists break down the scene into a few components. They are really good at like thinking like a camera, since that's the whole point of storyboarding. You are the camera, you're the director, you're placing the camera in the scene. So you have to make decisions like, are we looking down? Are we looking up? What kind of lens are we using? So for example, to answer those questions, you look at the horizon line, the floor, the sky, and the vertical vanishing points. So in dynamic angles, the horizon line is usually out of the frame. So it's either going to be like up here and we're going to be looking down at the floor like this. For example, it is the case in a pose like this. The horizon line is probably like way over here somewhere. Or the horizon line in a more dynamic shot is going to be really low. And this basically means that we're going to be seeing a lot of the sky. So we're going to be seeing up. We're looking up at a character. And depending on what lens you use, the floor can also get really dynamic really quickly. So for example, this shot right here, the horizon line is right here. It's really low, so that means we're looking up at this character. And this is drawn with a wide angle lens, and we can tell because these lines here, the floor grid is advancing on us really quickly. So as opposed to something like this, where the floor grids are like really super parallel, this one, they're all converging really quickly to this point over here. So that means that this foot is going to be really close to us, and this foot is quite far away. So be able to notice a difference between what a grid of a wide angle lens is going to look like. A wide angle lens is going to converge and start exaggerating really quickly, and a telephoto lens is going to stay like way more consistent like this. And we can take a look at some more examples from these thumbnails that I did. So the horizon line for this thumbnail right here is quite low, which means I got the opportunity to do a wide angle lens because these lines, the floor is going to expand out really quickly. Whereas a thumbnail like this, it's slightly more telephoto because these are not converging super quickly and tend to stay a little bit more even. And so next, let's address vertical vanishing points. I think this is something that's going to really define whether you have a telephoto lens or a wide angle lens. So vertical vanishing point basically just addresses like whether you're looking up or down at a subject and how extreme that perspective gets. So for example, for this thumbnail, the vertical vanishing points are kind of like this. And so eventually these vertical lines are going to meet down here. And what that just means is that the top of the subjects are going to be bigger than the feet. That's like literally all that means. And for this one, it is the opposite. I just marked in the verticals like this, just to indicate to myself that the higher we go in space, the smaller the subject gets, and the lower we are, the bigger the subject gets. So for example, this one from Jessica, this is like a telephoto lens because all of these are kind of like super proportionate. These characters are in the proportions that they should be. But if we wanted to turn this pose into a wide angle like vertical basically just means the head is going to get bigger while the rest of them get smaller. So sorry Jessica, but it's going to just be like this. Now we have started to converge the verticals. So eventually the vertical lines are going to meet down here somewhere. And the heads of these characters are going to be proportionally bigger than the feet. And so if you compare the before and after, it was quite proportional. The vertical lines are probably pretty parallel here. And so if you want to start drawing characters in perspective, like first of all, make sure to lay down a grid, whether that be a ground plane if you're going to see the ground, or a sky if you're going to be looking up at the characters. So that's going to be your number one step, just to start to understand the space that these characters are going to be in. And then something really helpful is to, like, if you're going to see the whole body of the character, is to place the feet. Understanding where the feet are is going to help you a lot in the long run. For example, here she's just indicated that this foot is going to be in front and this foot is going back in space. And whatever happens up here, no matter what, these feet are going to be planted like this. And as for this top-down one, she has indicated that this foot is going to be over here, this foot is going to be over here, and this is basically how wide this character's stance is going to be. And so if you recall our form drawing lessons, then you can start to like block out the forms. And Jessica does a pretty good job of simplifying. You can see like she basically just uses like super simple primitive forms to build her characters. And that works really well for not overcomplicating things. And let's do this one here. She's planted the feet. She said this character is going to be have a very wide stance. Alright, so for your assignment for this video, what I've done is I've created 6 thumbnails here. For these ones, I've filled in the grids and guidelines of the angle that we're looking at the scene from. And I want you to draw in poses that will work in the space. So this one is kind of a low horizon where we're looking at the floor over here. This one, we're looking at the floor completely. And this one, we're looking at the sky. I drew in some green guidelines to indicate vertical perspective. And for the last 3, I want you to draw your own guidelines, experiment with the horizon line, and I want you to put in poses that work in that space as well. So here I've recorded a time lapse of me doing these assignments, just so you have like an example of how someone would approach this. So I've simplified the figure, as you can see. I did one standing pose, and I'm trying to do a more dynamic pose as well. You can do as many figures as you want. You can make them as big or as small as you want. You can try out standing poses, dynamic poses, like whatever. As you can see, I changed this one quite a lot because I couldn't figure out like what kind of pose I wanted to go for. But when you're doing this, pay attention to the points that are like touching the ground. For example, his hand is touching the ground, both of his feet are touching the ground, and like just be spatially aware of where those points are on the grid. For this person, I drew his feet first. And I changed where his feet go, but it's good to just have like an idea before you start drawing the upper body. For this one, I wanted to draw someone like holding out their hand. Someone a little bit more cheerful than the guy on the right. For this bottom up one, I tried to follow the vertical converging points and make the parts that are closer to the camera a little bit bigger and the parts that are higher up a little bit smaller. And when you're looking up at a subject, you're going to see the underneath of a lot of things. For example, the underneath of his chin, the underneath of his like arm planes. Here I am like going back and making sure like everything is planted and everything makes sense. And I'm just going to go in and like fill in the silhouette for each of these. When you're drawing in perspective, it can be hard too. Sometimes your figures get mushy and you can't really tell what the pose is doing anymore. So you always like keep in mind that the silhouette should be clear no matter what perspective you're in. And this is just also so we can like separate the character from the background. So yeah, good luck with this one. It might be kind of hard if you've never drawn in perspective before or thought about perspective, but I believe that anybody can learn this. That's the end of this basic posing chapter, and I'll see you guys in the next one, which is about dynamic posing, which is like literally the whole point about why I made this class. So kind of excited. I'll see you guys there.